Hello and welcome to Partially Redacted. I'm your host, Sean Faulkner, and today I'm joined by Kirk Marple, CEO and co-founder of Graphlit, and we'll be talking about managing unstructured data, ETL, RAG, and LLMs. Kirk, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. So you're the CEO and co-founder of Graphlit. What's the backstory on Graphlit? Why did you start it? What problem you're trying to solve, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, we really started thinking about it as an unstructured data platform. So what I was seeing after being CTO of a couple different places, trying to build platforms like this in-house, there wasn't good tooling for unstructured data. And it was 3 years ago. And a lot of if you look at the structured data space, like Fivetran and Snowflake, I wasn't seeing that parallel in the unstructured world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's been tons of work on structured data for a long time. Relational databases go back, probably 50 plus years at this point. I think the first commercially available relational databases were maybe in the late 70s. But the reality is 80 to 90% of the world's data is unstructured. And I think I recently read that there's 175 billion terabytes of unstructured data predicted to be available by 2025. So it's most of the data in the world is largely unused because working with it is really, really hard. And companies are essentially sitting on mountains of this stuff and don't really have a way to work with it. And even with tools like data lakes, there's just a lot of manual work involved with actually maintaining and building a data lake, and then all the things that go along with keeping it up to date. And even then, you're really sort of mapping that stuff into some sort of structured representation of the data anyway to make it accessible. So, outside of prior to in your previous experience, what are companies doing to try to manage unstructured data today, and where are those tools kind of falling short?
Yeah, I mean, if you look back at kind of content management systems, document management systems, that was kind of where the world was for many years. And it was very document centric. And there was a lot of companies that could do document analysis. But as you start to get into multimodal data hey, I have a Zoom recording, I have Slack messages, I have all this other stuff, those tools would fall down. And what we kind of looked at it, I spent 10 years in the broadcast video industry. So a lot of metadata focused, large files, distributed platforms, and kind of brought a lot of those ideas to this of look, if we have to have, a wide variety of data formats we need to support, scalable platform, and then indexing of that data for good retrieval is super important. And that kind of, is how we kind of got to the RAG as kind of a layer on top of that.
Mm-hmm. And, I think too, as the industry matures, not only do we need tooling that actually allows us to access the data, but then you need systems that scale, have observability, are easier to maintain, require essentially less DIY. Yep. So, what are you seeing from customers that you work with in terms of, maturity of the market?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was this big sort of flip around, I guess, about 18 months ago when ChatGPT came out and LLMs, good LLMs that became kind of just easy to access via an API. And also there was a sort of the open source projects like LangChain, Llama Index kind of, originated around that time. And they were really the kind of, leaders, the early leaders in this space of, hey, how do I write orchestration frameworks for unstructured data, getting it into LLMs. And I think what I believe is now there's kind of a second wave of you don't have to DIY, you don't have to pull all the pieces together, but we're getting back to more of a managed platform, like platform as a service concept, where I think a lot of the basics, even the advanced kind of techniques have been shaken out. And you can have a managed service that really gives you a lot of the functionality without having to get into all the weeds with it. And that's what we're focused on.
Mm-hmm. So, can you walk me through a little bit, how would I go about actually using Graphlit? What am I doing with it? And what's a use case that's helping me solve?
Yeah, really think of it as it's a funnel for your unstructured data. That's the first part is we have both a push and a pull model of you can send us URLs that will download, ingest, and prepare into our knowledge graph, and that's our data storage for Graphlit. But we also have a pull model where you can point us at a Slack channel, a SharePoint document library, an RSS feed, and we'll continually pull from that data. So you have to have both. You have to have that continual ingestion to really play in this space. And so I mean, ingestion is a big part of it, but then preparation, we call it, which is, I mean, kind of going from whatever source you're taking, you're getting into text, into it. So it's something that you can provide to the LLM. And that would be through audio transcription, PDF extraction, like markdown conversion and things like that. And then you get into the chunking and the embeddings and kind of all the preparation for semantic search. And a lot of that is, I mean, that flow is completely automated. So the developer just has to point us at data, and we handle everything else up until the point you make a search request or an LLM conversation, you prompt a conversation.
So you're primarily focused essentially on taking this unstructured data and preparing it, like prepping it for RAG. So you're doing the entire like pipeline basically down to storing it some. Are you working with existing like vector databases for storage? Like how does that part work?
Yeah. To get into the weeds, so I mean, we basically get a textual format that we kind of call our mezzanine. It's a JSON structure that has chunks and sections, and so it's a hierarchical structure of whatever we get the data from, and then we break that apart, create the vector embeddings, and then put that into a vector database. And so we're using Azure AI Search, which is previously had been a kind of more of a textual search engine, like an OpenSearch or something like that, or Elasticsearch. And then I guess in the last year, they added vector search capabilities. And so we've been using that as our basically our search engine underneath the hood, which has been working great. And then that kind of gets you the R in retrieval, in RAG, and the retrieval part. And search is a huge part of that. And then we have our own RAG pipeline that we kind of call it like prompt compilation, that we take all the sources, we can re-rank them, we can like prioritize different ones over others, and then basically prepare the prompt that you could send into an LLM. And we do the LLM integration as well. So we can call Anthropic Claude, or we can call OpenAI GPT-4. We take the results back and then store the conversation history, which also becomes searchable, and then provide citations back for the customer. So that's, I mean, it can be as simple as one API call to ingest a URL, like a PDF URL, and then one call to prompt conversation.
Okay, so it sounds like you're basically, by using Graphlit, I'm replacing like potentially a whole bunch of different tools that I might be sort of cobbling together. Maybe I'm using like elements of LangChain and sentence transformer and these types of things to essentially break up my text into chunks, and then I'm going to send it through a model to create the embeddings and all that sort of stuff. Essentially, you're sort of offloading all of that through this managed service model. Is that right?
100%. Yep, you're dead on. And I think, I mean, there's a trade-off. I mean, some people like getting into the weeds with it and be able to kind of configure their RAG pipelines and do different things. But what we found is, I mean, we do provide knobs. I mean, so there is access the developers have to, I mean, basically change their retrieval strategy or change their prompt rewriting strategy. But a lot of it is has really commoditized, I mean, per se, that there is a standard structure of once we can have good retrieval, you can have very good RAG. And we've done some recent validation scoring with an open source project called Tonic Validate, and actually came out on top, I mean, from our testing against, I mean, the LangChain, LumIndex, OpenAI Assistance API. So we know that our RAG pipeline is high quality for retrieval and can get the right answers. And then we can focus on really the scalability and the, just extending features on top of that.
Mm-hmm. And then you said currently that you're relying on Microsoft's one of their vector database sources. Is there flexibility in terms of where I end up pushing the embeddings in terms of vector database, as well as like what kind of model I ultimately end up using?
Yeah, on the vector storage, we're not exposing that, so we're not letting you swap out to Qdren or Pinecone. It was an opinionated decision. I mean, to say there's a lot of other products that can do that. I mean, if you really want to cobble together all the pieces yourself, we can do that. But we basically embedded and integrated that. But the models currently we're defaulting to Ada 002 from OpenAI, and basically this quarter we'll let you pick from their new small and large embedding, from like Cohere embedding and some other like Gina embeddings and those kind of things. Embedding is the only thing we don't allow selection of today. We do it on the completion side, but we'll be filling that gap later this quarter.
And then as part of that, like I've heard that when it comes to like retrieval and sort of getting the right like context to apply in a RAG-based system, you want a fairly good match between the way that you generated the embeddings for essentially the data that you're making part of the retrieval, as well as essentially the way the model functions. Is that part of the goal there?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is, I mean, if you've embedded it with one embedding model, you want to be able to retrieve that via cosine similarity with the same embedding. And so when you pass in the text from the prompt, you only really want to find things that have been embedded the same way. Otherwise, you get, I mean, some strange results. So we do track that, like in every embedding chunk in the vector database. I mean, we store what embedding model was used for it, and so that'll let us swap those out pretty easily.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the challenges that people typically run into if they're not using essentially something like Graphlit and they're cobbling together sort of these multiple open source tools? Like, where do they run into problems essentially with setting up this kind of pipeline for a RAG system?
I mean, I think the biggest thing we've heard is it's easy to get started. I mean, if you just want to chat with a PDF or some files on disk, I mean, you can put the piece together. There's demos out there for that. But once you start getting into, okay, well, PDFs are great, but how do I do audio? How do I incorporate audio transcription? Or how do I do re-ranking? Or how do I pull from Slack? And there are data connectors, but I mean, you have to think about what's the DevOps part of this. I mean, how do you actually host this in production? How do you get this running? I mean, that's honestly where a lot of the harder part is I need a consistent service that I can run an application on. And what we found is people flip over to us, they get some experience kind of dabbling in this space and then realize, wow, this is not my core business. Like my core business is something above here. And I want to focus on that, not this infrastructure. And so it's kind of like there's managed Postgres services now or servers now. And it's the same pattern of, at some point, you don't want to have to deal with that. And you just want to focus on your core business.
Yeah, or if you're doing even traditional ETL,
yeah,
and you know, it's one thing to write a connector from, I don't know, like Salesforce into your warehouse, but if you need to create 100 bespoke connectors, then that starts to become like an entire team's job essentially within your organization, versus going and using some existing platform like a Fivetran.
And for us, I mean, we just released a Microsoft Teams connector feeds last week. I mean, literally internally, it took like a day to build. I mean, on our side, we have the patterns built. And if somebody needs a new connector, we can add it very quickly. And the good thing is it reuses so many other parts of the platform that, I mean, we're able to get it up and running. It's high quality, and we can deliver that value where they would have had to get dedicated developer to it, probably take some off topic with what they're trying to really focus on. And that's really what we've seen. I mean, and even some other more esoteric ones, like we just added GitHub issues and Jira and Linear gestion. And so for product teams who are trying to kind of pull together data from, engineering and product groups, that's a whole other thing where you have to deal with authentication and the continual kind of ingestion and even rate limiting, retries. Everybody, like, it's easy to build a demo, but how can you make it reliable? And and even the observability point you kind of brought up at the start is a key part of this tracking all the operations, giving the ability to go back and debug this. And that's a lot of where we had requests from some of the early customers of, this is great, but I actually now want to be able to I don't want to have to talk to you on your support channel if I have an issue. Can I just look at the logs kind of thing? And that's something we're working on right now. We have it now where we have a full audit log of every operation that we were using for our billing telemetry, but now we've extended that to, hopefully be almost like Stripe quality logs where they give you every operation in detail. And that's what we're adding that into our developer portal. So they get search and they get all of the good logging capabilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think these types of services are really going to change the way that businesses just leverage all the stuff like that. Every single day that I wake up and I look at my Slack messages, inevitably there's some question in there by somebody about some not knowing where something is, or it's the same question I've seen 15 times, and it's the answer to it is in Confluence, or it's in Guru or Jira or some of these places, and they don't know where to find it, or they don't want to take the time to look at it. So it's easier to just ask that question on Slack. but then that creates a lot of like context switching and thrashing for folks. And once you get to be like a really big organization with thousands of people, like that just becomes a huge like time sink for those companies to answer all these questions that have already been answered somewhere where people just don't know how to get access to it.
And I mean, that's like, there's companies like Glean who's focused on workplace search, and they're trying to solve that problem from sort of the application level down. And I mean, it's a great concept. I mean, obviously a very needed concept. And I mean, essentially are more like that, but for developers. So you could build that kind of capability into any application, and you could build sort of a Glean-esque Slack bot. I mean, and we have demos of those kind of things. But it really comes down to, I mean, maybe somebody wants something bespoke. They wanted to have their data sources or integrate with their applications more deeply. And so we're kind of that API alternative to that.
Or even if they want to make it so that they can have like the chat service or build like an agent that can actually take some sort of action based on then you need a lot of like internal information. Maybe it needs to connect to internal services. That might not be something that you're comfortable, handing off to some company to basically use their service to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you seeing like businesses like struggle with wanting to build something like a RAG powered application that uses their own internal data, but they aren't sure what that might mean from like a privacy and security perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's changing quickly. I mean, we saw probably even 6-9 months ago where there was sort of this anti-cloud, like, oh, we don't want to send any of our data to the cloud. There was that tension there. I think it's subsided a bit in my recent discussions. I mean, there are people that want, I mean, purely private, even just like on your laptop solutions, and that's not our focus. But then there's hey, I have internal data. I mean, I'm comfortable with now people understand that via the API, OpenAI is not training on your data. And they feel a little more comfortable with now understanding kind of the lay of the land with the LLMs. And then for us, I mean, we do partitioning of the data by basically even by every application gets its own dedicated cloud storage and sort of that partitioning. And then what we're coming out with later this quarter is a fully managed app, like a sandbox of our platform on the Azure Marketplace that somebody could have running in their own Azure subscription. And that really solves the last mile of the questions we've gotten, where people are like, this is great, but we really don't want to have a multi-tenant SaaS. We really want this to be on our own. And the good thing for us, we've architected it where it's easy for us to deploy it basically in any Azure sub, and then they get full control over their data. And then they also don't have to pay usage costs. It's more of a flat licensing model, which people like as well.
Yeah, so under the multi-tenant model, that's running under essentially your Azure account.
Yeah. So it's a multi-tenant SaaS, but then we are partitioning the physical storage, like where the data sits, on a per customer basis. So they do. I mean, so we're not sharing. Where the multi-tenancy for us is at the metadata and the vector database level today. And if somebody,
basically the control plane.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then if somebody wanted it fully segmented, then they can run their own instance of the whole thing.
Okay, and then under the new model that you're talking about, where it's in Marketplace, essentially someone is running then like a containerized version of that within their own Azure environment.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially just our, so it would be our data plane actually, but a data plane, a resource group basically in their Azure subscription that we would manage from our control plane. So our control plane would still be hosted. The data plane would just be a resource group that sits on their side, that we would just, I mean, we would have very thin access to.
Yeah, so there'd be some sort of secure link essentially between the control plane and the data plane that's running within their cloud environment.
Yeah, I mean, because the main reasons they talk back the control plane talks to the data plane today for provisioning. It talks back from data plane to control plane for billing. But in this case, it would be a little bit different because, I mean, there wouldn't be usage-based billing. So we wouldn't even need that back channel at this point. So the one big thing we're actually, working on right now is, okay, how do we do observability in that kind of model? Because, I mean, we use Azure App Insights. I mean, that's where a lot of our observability comes from. And in that model, we're talking to some folks. I mean, can we get access to that for observability, or do we have to pump that data to somewhere else? Or that's honestly the biggest question we have right now that we're sorting out.
Have you seen that these issues are something that crops up more for like an enterprise-sized company, or are these issues that every company is like wrestling with?
Yeah, I mean, we started off a lot. I mean, the SMB size company, multi-tenant's fine. I mean, they haven't really given that. But once we actually start to get into enterprise, which has really been over the last few months that we've been talking to more and more of those folks, and the security question does come up more. And that's really, we always had a roadmap item to do this managed app concept, but the priorities kind of really bumped up just from a lot of recent conversations.
I mean, how much do you see some of the concern over like cloud or private LLM, or even and now there's even stuff about like there are companies focused on how do we compress models so that we can run them on like local devices, and there are some like real use cases for that where if you need to do real time translation, you probably need to do that on a local device versus taking the hit, essentially sending that cloud. But some of it's also based on privacy and security concerns about like what's actually happening in the cloud. Like, how much do you see that is that sort of just a moment in time right now because this is also new and people kind of getting comfortable with it, or do you see it as like a real concern?
I mean, after living through the kind of on-premise to cloud migration, I mean, probably 10 years ago now, I think there is, you could argue for that it's a point in time. I mean, I really think like when we were dealing with the broadcasters, everything was on-prem, like in the heart of our business. But then towards the end of it, everybody was starting to look at cloud deployments and everybody's freaking out. Like, we don't want our data on the cloud. This is, I mean, something that, I mean, is like going to go on like on a TV channel. But nowadays, like so much of cloud production, if not, I mean, the majority of it is cloud native. And so I do think it's going to be, I mean, give it another few years, it'll be a lot more commonplace. And it's going to end up being, I mean, a cost issue too. I mean, we can sort of multiplex so many different customer workloads onto our platform today because of serverless and because of, I mean, sort of scale out and things like that. And I think, I mean, doing a dedicated deployment, if you're not using it, you're paying for those Kubernetes. Like, I mean, the server is running in your Kubernetes cluster. And so it's going to be a balance. And I think a lot is, I mean, what load are they running on it? Or is it, and if it's bursty, they're going to be putting extra money out for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you could be sucking up a ton of like compute resources, but also like in-house, like engineering resources. It's kind of like the old days when someone was running an Exchange server in a closet and having to manage their own like email and stuff like that. But now everybody's like the majority of companies, I think, that are modernized have moved to third-party services that manage that. And technically, all of these like probably highly confidential emails that are business oriented, that have contracts and other information that's internal to the company, are sitting in the cloud under Google or Microsoft or one of these types of vendors, and we essentially trust that those companies aren't looking at that information.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is, I mean, if they wanted to, I mean, they probably could. But I think the biggest thing a lot of people figure is, I mean, well, number one, with encryption, I mean, you can do a lot of your own protection, but in a lot of sense, it's almost because of the volumes. I mean, it's kind of like obscurity. I mean, sort of data obscurity. And I think, I mean, we'll see. I mean, with the LLMs, I mean, there's still a point like we have to pass the text from a Slack message to the LLM. So at some point, I mean, it has to be decoded. It can't be sent, I mean, fully encrypted over that to the LLM. But I think, I mean, a lot of it's transient too. And so that's, I think, finding the right balance on, I mean, what data is persistent, what data is kind of volatile and just gets thrown away. One of the issues is with like citations. I mean, how do you do a citation if it's some data that is behind some sort of security API? I mean, a secure API. I mean, if you want to show that text to the user, you have to store it somewhere. And so, I mean, I think that's the balance of, I mean, we do provide the ability to sort of have a cache of that data, but some people may just want to know, okay, well, what file was it in? But I don't want to have to see the text and to like sort of turn that security knob up. And so we're looking at giving some options there for kind of, I mean, how much data do we persist? Because it can affect the user experience. I mean, you may want to have that extra data there available for the consumer of your app.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to like some of the work that people do around like setting up guardrails and safety with LLMs, there's a lot of sort of fine tuning that happens to try to prevent people from doing certain things with an LLM. Do you think, are we putting too much responsibility directly on the LLM? Like they're designed to generate content, not necessarily like police themselves. And kind of, do you think it's unfair to try to bake these guardrails into LLM versus making that the responsibility is somewhere else, like the ETL layer, for example?
I think it's a great question. I mean, there's a couple of parts to the answer here. I mean, one is what we've been calling sanitization. And we have, I mean, kind of our ingestion, preparation, extraction part of our pipeline, but have been looking at injecting a sanitization stage into the workflow to say, okay, at this point, I want to PII sanitize or anything similar to that, the data, redaction, even visual redaction, like for video and audible for audio. And then we know everything downstream of that, like what hits disk, what hits the vector database, has been sanitized. And that's something that we've been talking to some folks about. And I think it's an obvious place to kind of extend this at that level. But the other side, I mean, and that would help the RAG. I mean, it's whatever the LLM was trained on plus the sanitized data that we're giving it through the prompt for the sources. But the other side of it is on the prompt side. I mean, if you have a chatbot, city organization, they can ask not safe for work things and really just, I mean, do you want to do classification and sanitization on the incoming prompt as well? And I mean, sanitization is obvious, but classification is important too, where, I mean, maybe you want to look for, I mean, jailbreak type things, or want to look for, okay, you shouldn't be asking about somebody that's, I mean, like, sure, there might be role-based security, but are you supposed to be asking about your manager's salary or things like that? And so I think we'll see it on both sides. And I think there's some really interesting, capabilities for that. I mean, part of it, you can sort of prompt your way around the basics of this to kind of control a little bit of it. But if you really want to get into the details, I mean, sanitizing the data in and out is going to, I think we'll start to see a lot more of that.
Yeah, and that's like where the company I work for is sort of focused on is like let's sort of shift some of those problems left where we understand what's going on a little bit better rather than putting a responsibility on the LLM. But I do think that what you brought up in terms of the prompting is a really important thing, and essentially, like as we start to sort of give access to all this data, we also need to make sure that, depending on who you are in the organization, you have a controlled level of access. Like if you're someone in customer support, you probably shouldn't be able to ask questions about the CEO's salary or financials of the business, or maybe even information that's related to a customer that you're not directly dealing with.
I think, I mean, that's where I think the storage mechanism of not just having one big pool of data. And when you're doing retrieval, I mean, the ability to, like, we have something called feeds, and feeds are kind of data sources that map to, say, some like a Slack channel or a folder. And we can then, I mean, by when they ask the question, we can say, okay, only filter by these feeds. And so that would, I mean, and that you can eliminate, no, they can't ask about that SharePoint folder where the manager's salary is in or something like that. So I think having that ability and then with RBAC and with different things like that, I think it's going to become more and more of the retrieval mechanism, which really just harkens back to, okay, how do you search over, I mean, sort of enterprise search and limit what you're looking at? So I think it's where we're going to see the application developers kind of focused on, of getting creative around that side.
Yeah, we basically need those controls. I mean, there was a time, like, there's the old joke about like the DBA knowing essentially like the next quarter's like financial outcome before like the CFO of the company, because 15, 20 years ago, if you had access to the database, you basically had access to all of the database in the clear, and you could do whatever you want with it. So now we've luckily evolved a lot from there, and people can work on databases without necessarily having access to like all the customer and employee information.
Yep. No, and I think we'll see that as these use cases grow, it's kind of formalizing some of the access control mechanisms and kind of doing things. I mean, it's in a lot of ways, it's nothing new. It's just kind of applying old patterns to new data. And I think that's where I think hopefully we won't try and reinvent the wheel in a lot of those stuff.
Yeah, I think part of it is like you said, like sort of defining those patterns and the standards. And a lot of that stuff in the database world came out of Oracle, because as they went up market and started working with enterprises, they essentially had to invent a lot of stuff to make enterprises comfortable with using like an Oracle database. And then when you move to the cloud, you had to put even more sort of controls in place. So they got defined over time. And we're just very, very early in the stage of generative AI and LLMs, where not all that stuff has necessarily been defined.
Yeah, and I think the domain of what the retrieval is over, I think, is going to grow. I mean, currently, I don't see massive domains of data. I think people are starting with, I mean, a subset of data in the organization, getting experience using LMs, getting experience with RAG, understanding, I mean, kind of the predictability or non-predictability of it. I think that's kind of what 2024 feels like. Is there last year was kind of the DIY. Everybody, it was like the bleeding edge folks were the ones working on it. This year, I'm now getting questions from people that, I mean, really are the perfect customers of, hey, I'm in a domain that really isn't LM or AI or anything specific, but they're like, they know what RAG is. They know now how to apply that to their business. And they're not like, they wouldn't go train a model themselves, and they wouldn't know about fine tuning, but they basically understand the RAG concept, or they're hearing about it. And that's been really interesting. I mean, that's really just been the last 3 months or so. So I think the rest of this year will be interesting. That, I mean, enterprises and more kind of other domains will now start to understand the value. And I expect this all to accelerate. I mean, yeah, just a quick tidbit. I was at an in-person demo, and it was a bunch of just like probably 300 or 400, just, I mean, business folks and from all over different domains. And almost every one of them knew what RAG was. And I was kind of surprised because, I mean, just a few months ago, 6 months ago, that wasn't the case. So,
yeah. Yeah, I agree. Like, I think even like a year ago when I first started having some of these conversations, like very few people knew what RAG was. And now, at least in the tech bubble anyway that we live in, it's become something that people are at least like somewhat familiar with. Like, they understand enough of it to have like an understanding of what it's used for at the very least, which is probably the most important thing to really understand anyway. One of the other trends I'm seeing for 2024 is, like, last year I think was a lot about like RAG and early RAG systems. How do you do this sort of stuff? And now it's all about like context window length.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on that? Like, how do you think like the space around like these like million token context lengths that people are talking about, basically like infinite context windows, what that will mean and how that changes sort of the landscape of RAG?
Yeah, and I think it's, I mean, there's also been the kind of RAG is dead meme that went around for a little bit. And I mean, my opinion is, I mean, if you just look at RAG and you take the retrieval part of it, search isn't going anywhere. I mean, you still need to be able to limit the data set from them. I mean, I don't think I mean, people say, oh, well, if you just have a couple PDFs, so you just have a little bit of data, you don't need it. But the thing is like, as these solutions expand, the corpus of data is going to expand. I mean, so now it's like, okay, well, how much data does an enterprise have that you can open up and throw into this thing? Then, I mean, how can you just pump every Zoom meeting, every Slack message, every SharePoint document, and have an LLM make sense of it? And I think it's just a naive take right now of, I mean, larger context models are awesome, like, because when, I mean, we're able to get higher quality RAG output because we get more context, we can fill in more detail. Now, that, I mean, there's still always going to be more data in the database than we can fit into that context window. And the other thing is metadata. It helps you provide more context, not just the text, but then you can have some space for the metadata of the document, the title, the author, and things like we're doing with GraphRag, like the relationships, the entities around that. So I think it just gives the ability to use that space for other needs. And that's what we're seeing. So I don't know. I definitely think RAG. I don't think RAG is going to look the same next year in 2025 that it does today, but retrieval is not going away, and I think the pattern will just evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that like the larger window actually helps RAG in a lot of ways. Like, it opens up new potential use cases. But you still need, like, it needs to be relevant, essentially. Like, if you're just stuffing the context window with a bunch of irrelevant stuff, it's not going to help the LLM actually like come up with a good answer. You need essentially good context is the important part, and that comes down to essentially the retrieval step. So things will smooth out, and it'll probably be like a much more evolved sort of view of how you build like a RAG system. But I agree. Like, I think that part of it's still going to exist.
And I think the re-ranking algorithms like from Cohere and Gina, and there's a new company, Pongo, that, I mean, those just become more important because, I mean, vector search gets you so far down the road, but having a good re-ranker after that really helps tighten up the context. And we've seen a noticeable difference just by, I mean, popping Cohere in there on top of what we're already doing. And I mean, some cases it's like, oh, okay, only these two sources are actually relevant. The rest are just junk, even though the vector similarity search found them. And I mean, that is a really big boost for RAG quality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the other part too, as we start to move away from probably like the sort of co-pilots and chatbot like experiences and more into things that are like autonomous agents or agents that can like do something, then suddenly it's not necessarily about having a system that's as close to real-time response as possible. So the long context windows open up potentially new use cases, but again, the retrieval part of that is essential in order to essentially do whatever the compute part of the agent is that it needs to do. Like maybe that's writing rather than just writing a snippet of code, like writing a full-on application or something like that. Then suddenly you need really relevant retrieval, but you also need the long context window to make something like that possible.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing I think people sometimes ignore is the output window is very small. I mean, a lot of these newer models, they have like 128K input, but 4K output. And so, I mean, I think that kind of scatter gather kind of model, or like, I mean, the MapReduce model, like from Spark, like that, those kind of patterns are still very valuable because you can only shove so much. I mean, you can shove a lot of data in, but you can't get a lot of data out. So if you're doing long context output or long format output, you really have to use one of these kind of scatter gather models, like patterns on top of that. And I think that's what we're seeing too. Is, I mean, a lot of times I've said is like chat is just the first consumption method that people are familiar with. I mean, the heart of what the value is really the RAG, the kind of behind the scenes, the ingest and the RAG and everything. And then we're just going to find other consumption methods. Agents are going to be one. We have something called alerts that are kind of like semantic Google alerts. So you can essentially recurring on a recurring basis, you can prompt the LLM and format output and like post a Slack summary or something like that. And it's kind of like a mini agent, but I think those kind of things are going to be, I mean, I really see that's going to grow as well. And so the RAG just becomes almost like a library, like a package that you just use. And that's why we really believe that an API first approach enables agents so much easier, that now you just have one API to talk to and you can focus on your agent library and integrate at that level. So
yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think that's awesome. And as we start to wrap up, like what's next for Graphlit? Like what are you sort of focused on that you can share?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is obviously the Azure Marketplace. This quarter, we're going to be at Microsoft Build, in a couple weeks now, and I'm demoing and really focusing on providing more deployment options for our customers is number one. We're also working on basically bringing GraphRag to market. We've been doing a lot of prototyping and testing with, we do all the ingestion into the knowledge graph today, and you can search and filter with the knowledge graph and visualize it, but actually incorporating that into the RAG. We've been working to tune that, and we'll be launching that later this year. And really, I mean, a lot of it is just continually listening to customers. What new data sources do they need? What new observability things do they need? And yeah, we just released a new Python and TypeScript SDK, which has been starting to get a lot of use now. And so I think seeing other consumption methods for the API, not just kind of going direct to our native GraphQL API.
Awesome. Well, Kirk, thanks so much for being here. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, me too. No, great question. So appreciate it.
Thanks and cheers.
Okay, take care.